Hey everybody, we are in week 9 of vocab, and as I mentioned in class, this week's vocab terms are sort of themed in the sense that these are all terms used to describe different genres of literature. So a quick couple of reminders before I start the PowerPoint. Not every text can be described by one of these genres or terms, and multiple texts could be described by a text could be described by multiple terms. I'll say it that way. So you'll see, for instance, again, that I'm going to use Huck Finn in several of these terms. So anyways, let's get to getting here and start. I always do this wrong every single time. Now let's try it. For some reason it don't like me. Here we go. Now I'm going to screen share with you, as I usually do. Maybe. There we go. Now you can stop looking at my ugly mug and look at the PowerPoint. Okay, week 9. The first word is Bildungsroman, and we use this one in class. I think we mentioned it a few times. So this is essentially a coming-of-age novel. Typically, we have a protagonist that's a child or who is a young adult, and experiences within the novel are teaching him or her about the realities of the adult world. And think about the theme in a lot of these books kind of being innocence to experience, because usually that child goes through things that are complex or painful. They realize that the real world is filled with disillusionment. And so these are, again, all texts where the child is sort of being initiated into the adult world, if you will. To Kill a Mockingbird, Huck Finn, Great Expectations are all really great examples of this. Some of you have read Jane Eyre or The Kite Runner. Those would be a couple more examples of a Bildungsroman. The next term is epistolary novel. And this one's actually a pretty simple explanation. This is a text that consists of letters or diary entries or newspaper clippings. Kind of think of them as episodes. And so all of these different episodes tell the story. Now, the entire text doesn't have to be a series of diary entries or the newspaper clippings. It could be just part of that text. So it could read like a typical narrative, and then there's maybe a series of letters involved in that. Or, on the other hand, the entire thing could be a series of letters or newspaper clippings that help tell the complete story. Those clippings could be written, or the diary entries could be written by one character or by multiple characters. It doesn't matter, actually, whatsoever. An epistolary novel. Examples, Dracula, Color Purple. Probably the most common example that I could think of would be like Anne Frank and her diary, and how it's all sort of these entries that explain her story and her time in the annex. Next one, Gothic novel. So a Gothic novel is typically characterized by its traits, by its characteristics. It often has a dark and mysterious setting. There's often supernatural elements, even ghosts sometimes in Gothic novels. They tend to be highly emotional or melodramatic, even macabre. I don't know if that's a term that you know, but I'll spell it for you because I'm guessing many of you don't know how to spell it. It's M-A-C-A-B-R-E, and note to self, that is a great tone word, macabre. A lot of times they have, the setting is not only dark and mysterious, sometimes it's desolate. And I would say mysterious events often occur, and then an atmosphere of terror. That's how I would sort of describe it. Some examples, Dracula, Frankenstein, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the ones that I put up here for you. If you think about Edgar Allan Poe, you might think of Gothic novel. And so those are some examples for you. Next is novel of manners. These are kind of interesting because they detail or explain the social customs and or morals of an era, or the appropriate social behaviors for a specific group. So it might be like how the upper middle class would be portrayed at this point in time, right, at this point in history. The best example I can think of, and it's an example you know very well, is The Great Gatsby, right? That book details how the certain group of people is living at this point in history, right? Very extravagant lifestyles. It's important to have money, and it's important to live beyond your means, right? For other people to see how you're living. And so that completely makes sense, and we're getting a lot of information about the customs and the morals and the social behaviors of the people that are in the book. The era doesn't necessarily matter, but a lot of the books of novel of manners are written kind of late 1800s. Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, Jane Eyre, Vanity Fair, Age of Innocence, The House of Mirth. Those are all writers who are writing in like late 1800s-ish time frame. I'd say Great Gatsby's kind of the one that doesn't fit, but I use that as an example since you're probably most familiar with that one. Novella, this is a term you know really well. I'm going to go really quick because I use this one in class. So a novel typically, you know, we think of it kind of as this book. It's a little bit daunting, but a novella is longer than a short story. It is shorter than a typical novel. What we're reading right now, Ayn Rand's Anthem, is a really good example. We know that it immerses us very quickly into the details of the plot, and there's not a lot of exposition to the story. A couple others you might be familiar with, Of Mice and Men fits into this category. Animal Farm fits here as well. And something I think maybe you read in middle school was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Next up is utopian, dystopian novel. I used to have these separate, but it doesn't make any sense to have them separated because what we think of as a utopia, okay, utopia, we think of kind of as this perfect place. In reality, the word utopia means no place. So a utopia can't truly exist. A perfect place doesn't exist. What we perceive in a story to be a utopia always ends up turning into a dystopia. Something goes wrong. You can't truly have this idea of a utopia. It may seem like a utopia, at least for a while, but there's always sort of these under rumblings that something else is going to happen. Think about like dark prophetic themes like oppression or abuse of power, loss of individuality, for instance. Like in Anthem as well, kind of fits into this category. The one that I always think of is Lord of the Flies. The boys get to this island and it is a utopia. There are no parents. They can do what they want. They can run around naked and do cartwheels and, you know, eat off the land and kill animals, and it's going to be great. But in reality, there's a lot of adult decisions that need to be made, and they're not prepared to make those. And so quickly they're fighting for power, and they're trying to find food, and what happens when something goes wrong. And so that's another really good example. I put a couple others on your screen. Science fiction is next. And basically, science fiction novel imagines the impact of real or hypothetical scientific developments. Okay, what would happen if? Okay, what would happen if? Fahrenheit 451 is a really great example of this. You know, sometimes we think of these really crazy, like, oh, I'm going to make this crazy monster out of some metal and it's gonna take over the universe, but it doesn't have to be sort of that sci-fi to fit science fiction novels. So it's basically where we propose this hypothetical. If the world were like this, what would the impact be? How would that impact society? A couple other really good examples, George Orwell's 1984 and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. A little bit disturbing, but very interesting about kind of reproduction, actually. The next one is romance novel, and I would say this is probably the most misunderstood of all of your literary terms, because often when we think of romance novel, you might think of like romantic, and it doesn't have to be romantic. When we talk romance novel, think of more idealized, a relationship that is perhaps an idealized love. So characteristics that describe a romance novel: idealistic, imaginative, and adventuresome. Often you have what we call a romantic hero, and he might be visiting, I'll use he, could be he or she, visiting a mysterious or exotic location. I always think of knights when I think of romantic novels, because they're supposed to be the essence of chivalry. And, you know, they go after the damsel in distress kind of thing. Often your protagonist in a romance novel has some sort of obsession with an idea or a person. Not in a perverse way, the obsession, but just that they pursue that thing or that person or that idea, and they can't sort of let it go. Okay. Examples, I suppose you want those. Wuthering Heights is a good example. Madame Bovary, The Count of Monte Cristo. There's a text called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. If you think of any of those sort of knight in shining armor kind of stories, they typically fit into a romance novel. Next up is picaresque. Picaresque. This is a novel that concentrates on sort of the misadventures of a young rogue. You have a young character who is often a social underdog in some way, doesn't fit in, sort of a misfit, if you will. And this person sort of adventures. Sometimes there's like this satirical or somewhat humorous undertone to something that is picaresque. A couple of the best examples I can think of are Huck Finn and Don Quixote. I know some of you have read part of that, at least in Spanish. Somebody brought up an example in previous years, and from what I can tell, it works. I've actually never seen this movie, but Pirates of the Caribbean, I believe, fits into this genre as well, and that was a reference that a lot of people seem to be really familiar with. Historical novel. So historical novel is simply grounded in a real context. It relies heavily on actual settings and factual details, but it is fiction, okay? But yet it's relying on actual places and actual events to take its sort of elaborating and on those factual settings and details. It typically centers on individuals or events from the past. Okay, so historical novel, it really is what it says. It's really usually about history. Okay, something that happened in history but fictionalized. Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens is a really good example. If anybody's read War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, it's a real fun one there. It's a little heavy, that's why I say that. It's also a good example of a historical novel. The next one is autobiographical novel, and I want to make it clear that this is different than an autobiography. Okay, so autobiography, we think of sort of this story, right, about this person. An autobiographical novel is fiction. Okay, so let's just make that clear right out of the gate. But often the protagonist is modeled after the author, and a lot of times there are some similarities in plot to the author's life, but yet again, we're talking, it is fiction. So it could be sort of like that, it's based on a true story kind of thing. These stories are always told in the first person, and that allows you to sort of directly interact with that protagonist's thoughts and feelings and those kinds of things. But once again, Autobiographical novel, not the same as autobiography, because an autobiographical novel is absolutely fiction with sort of these bits maybe scattered in that resemble real life. Psychological novel, a story that would emphasize things like internal motives and conflicts and opinions. And those internal motivations, conflicts, and opinions help develop the external action, what actually happens. So a lot of times you're in these characters' heads in a psychological novel. Couple really good examples of this one: Crime and Punishment, Catcher in the Rye, which you've read, and The Stranger by Albert Camus, who's French, is another good example of this. So focus on the internal, and then that helps create the action that exists in the story. Regional novel, not extremely common, but we're talking about a novel that accurately represents the habits, the speech, the folklore of a specific geographical region. It's giving you a real picture of what life is like for people in that particular environment, how the environment is influencing the inhabitants of the environment in a very specific region. Really, the best example I can think of this one is Huck Finn. It's just so reflective of, again, habits, speech, folklore, what people believe in. Life on the Mississippi. Two more. Sociological novel is one that depicts the problems and injustices of society. Often these kind of novels force you to make judgments and think about resolutions to problems. Okay. A couple really well-known examples that you know of: Grapes of Wrath. You haven't read that John Steinbeck novel that I know of, but maybe some of you've read it on your own. Lord of the Flies fits into here, right? Problems and injustices of society. And then To Kill a Mockingbird, I would also say, is probably the best of the three examples here, with sort of some of the race and class issues that exist within the course of that story. Finally, this one should be quick because we've already talked about allegory this year. So an allegorical novel, one that operates on two levels. Everything in that story is what it is, but yet there's a whole nother layer of meaning to it. I think that's all I'm going to say about that. Besides, we see the examples on the screen. Lord of the Flies, Animal Farm are probably the two best novel examples of an allegory, but we've talked about that term before. So I think that brings me to the end of my show. And let me know what questions you have when we get to class, and we'll see you very soon.